text and then commentate on it as we go. And every now and again, we'll stop and read a few specific portions of it. So here's where we start with this text. Following the descent from Cain to Lamech, chapter 4, which is where we were at last week, ends with a note of hope. So Cain has killed Abel, but we read Adam and Eve have another son, and his name is Seth. And Seth has a son named Enosh. And at that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Right, so that's how chapter 4 ends. That's what the text lets us know is going on. And then Moses, who is writing this, then goes back to Adam, and he begins to follow Adam's lineage through Seth. So we've already in chapter 4 followed Adam's lineage through Cain. Now we begin to follow it through Seth. And we come down to 528, and there is another guy named Lamech. I don't think that is an accident. And Lamech has a son named Noah, and he says, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one, Noah, shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. And then we're told that Lamech lives 777 years, and he dies. So let's unpack this for a second. Cain's line, Genesis 4, walks away from the Lord. That's where we were at last week. It hits a narrative peak in a guy named Lamech, who we already talked about, who demands vengeance 77 times. Right, so that's what Cain's line does. Seth's line calls on the name of the Lord. His narrative comes to another peak in a different dude named Lamech, who lives 777 years and who has a son who is going to bring relief and promise, and we know deliverance in the midst of judgment. So we come back to Moses, who's writing this, right? You're going, why are you talking about Moses? Moses is writing this. He's writing it as Israel is preparing to enter into the land of promise. They're going to be surrounded by nations that don't know the Lord, and he's presenting in the book of Genesis these genealogies. One walks away from God and one walks with God. He's pressing the question to Israel as they're about to enter the promised land: will you walk with God or will you walk away from him? One of those things is going to lead to destruction, and one of those things is going to lead to salvation. So you know how we all like to get to the genealogies and pay a lot of attention to them. We don't just skim them, right? Because we know that there's theological importance in them, right? Yes? That's what's actually happening here. These genealogies that we all come to are like, okay, I can't pronounce that, or that. Skim, where's it end? Moses is using these to make a theological point. He's saying, man, will you walk with God or will you walk away from him? And that question is still pressed to us today. Will you walk with God or will you walk away from him? Will you call on his name or will you go your own way? Who are you going to follow? Now, one of the best illustrations I've ever heard from this came from maybe one of the most bizarre places, and that was Kanye West. So if any of you are kind of cultural students, you'll remember that, I don't know, what was it, 6-7 years ago, good old Kanye put out a gospel album, right? And there was a lot of debate within the Christian community as to whether or not that was legit. At this point, I'm going to say Kanye seems to have kind of gone off the rails again. But either way, right, Kanye's kind of had these images of Jesus throughout his career, and we could push back on whether or not he's actually following him or not. But regardless, he puts out this gospel album. And I remember listening to him share at one point in this gospel album how when he was this little kid, or in regard to this album, he was this little kid. And he lived somewhere, he didn't really get a whole lot of snow, and he came out for the first time when it had snowed where he lived, and his dad was with him, and he's like, hey, listen, little Kanye, it's not Lil Wayne, right? I know that can be a rapper name, but right, the little Kanye, when he's a little kid, he's like, hey, don't worry, just step where I step and you won't sink down in the snow. And so Kanye does what something we've probably all done at one point or another, walked in the footsteps of the person who is breaking the path. This is what we're getting at with this text. Which way will you walk? Will you walk your own way or will you walk in the way that God has trod and shown you? From Kanye West, right, of all places. will you walk with him? And man, this isn't a hypothetical question. Will you actually follow him? In light of the New Testament especially, we say, will you commit to the way of Jesus? What does Jesus do time and time and time again in the New Testament? Come and follow me, right? And he doubles down on this. There's so many times where he could be like, I'm going to make this a little bit easier for you, and he doesn't. He's like, no, come and follow me. You think it's going to be easy? No, pick up your cross and follow me. And we're pressed with this question, will we follow him? We come back to the text, and following the genealogies, Moses launches into what we call the flood narrative. We'll read a little bit here. That he says this: as man multiplied on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive. They took as their wives any who they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend or abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. They were the mighty men of old who were the men of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth. He said, I will blot out man whom I've created from the face of the land. So let's talk about this for a minute, because everybody loves to speculate about the Nephilim. The popular interpretation of this text over the last probably couple hundred years or 100 years is that the Nephilim are probably fallen angels who are intermarrying with humans and creating these kind of jacked up demigods, right? While that is a possible interpretation, right, the text gives us some, like there was something about the descendants of these that was somewhat unique. So while that's a possible interpretation, it also has some problems. Primarily, you have to sexualize or specifically engender angelic beings, especially even fallen ones, to have this happen. And man, I'm just not sure that the scriptures allow us to do that. So while that's possible, and while it's tantalizing to imagine a world where you've got these kind of demigod, half human, half demon beings running around, and then that's what leads to God wiping out the majority of humanity in the flood, while that's possible, man, I'm just not convinced that that's the best interpretation available to us in regard to the Nephilim. Certainly, I wouldn't say that we should make any doctrines based off of that, right? But what I think is more likely is that the line of Seth, right, the sons of God, those who called on God's name, have started going after the line of Cain. Right, so the ones who once, not that long ago, called on the name of the Lord are now seeing the daughters of the culturally progressive Cainites, and they're going, man, they look pretty good. And they begin abandoning the Lord. So while man is becoming great on the one hand in many ways, they are also becoming increasingly wicked, so that the thoughts of his heart were only evil continually. The world has become so decrepit that literally every thought man has leads to evil. And all of a sudden, we come back again to this same question. Okay, well, who are you going to walk with? Because if you walk in your own way, it results in wicked and evil lives. But if you will call upon the Lord, then he will preserve you. Will you be faithful? And this is specifically going to press into what the scriptures emphasize continually on this theme, specifically when we talk about the Nephilim, right? That how you express your sexuality and with who matters, right? You are going to see this over and over in the scriptures. Who you bind yourself to in sexual union will have an impact on your ability to answer those questions. Will you walk with the Lord, or will you walk on your own? Right? That's why Paul will write in 2 Corinthians 6:14, don't do it. Right? Specifically, he says, don't be unequally yoked with unbelievers, for what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Satan? What portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? We are the temple of the living God. Paul, over and over and over and over again in one verse, is like, don't. Don't be yoked with unbelievers. It's kind of like when you're a kid and you did something wrong and one of your parents, probably your mom, maybe your dad, is like, okay, you shouldn't do that. You're like, okay, I know. Here's why. Okay, I get it. Here's why some more. Oh, okay. And here's why again. Okay, why shouldn't you have done that? Right? Like it's just over and over and over again. Paul's like, don't do this. Don't be unequally yoke. He hammers this at his audience. So let's talk about this for a minute just to illustrate this. The idea of being yoked to someone or something comes from kind of an agricultural mindset. Around here, we actually have something that could probably help us with this. So every year we got the fair in town, and at the fair they have the draft horse pull, right? So if you were to go and to watch that, you're going to see these big old draft horses. They're like 17 hands high plus. They team up together, and then they pull, and they see how much weight they can carry, right? So they are equally yoked. You got these two behemoth horses, and they're able to pull together. Now, I want you to just picture this for a minute. Take one of those horses out and put a mini horse in there, right? How well is that going to work? It's not going to work, right? Because they're unequally yoked. The whole picture is one's going to pull and the other one's not even going to be able to. Right? And this idea is that there kind of chaos will ensue. And what's interesting, we often apply this verse in 2 Corinthians. We're like, we'll talk about dating, we'll talk about marriage, don't be unequally yoked. I'm going to say to you that probably actually applies to a little bit more than that, right? But it definitely, at the very least, applies to romantic relationships. And it's not a suggestion, it's a command. The reason being, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, is that marriage is ultimately a gospel relationship. Right? So Paul will write in Ephesians and say, husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church. So ladies, let me ask you this for a moment. How can he love you the way that Jesus loves his church if he doesn't know and love Jesus? Paul also writes, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. So dudes, let me ask you this for a moment. How can she submit to you as the church submits to Christ if she doesn't know what that looks like? Man, even the wording of that is super offensive to our culture because they don't understand who Jesus is and what his relationship with the church is. Right, so this is a gospel-centered issue. And over and over again in the scriptures, you're going to see this play out. When God's people attempt to express their sexuality outside of God's plan, which is a one-flesh union between a man and a woman who are equally committed to Christ, it goes poorly. It's not just unwise, it's a sin. All right? So we've already quoted from Kanye. Let's do a little Beyonce this morning. All my single ladies, right? It's for free. And all of my single dudes, younger, older, don't care. Do not date someone who doesn't love Jesus the way that you love Jesus. Do not marry someone who doesn't love Jesus the way that you love Jesus. This is both a gospel and an obedience issue. And I want to make a real quick note here. This does not mean that you don't have friends with or interact with people who aren't Christians. By all means, please do. Have friends that aren't Christians. Don't be yoked to someone who is not. And we can come back to the text and see how this plays out. So in the midst of the increasing corruption and violence, God determines to make an end of all flesh. Things have gone so far sideways that God says, man, enough is enough. I'm going to wipe them out. But Noah finds favor in the sight of the Lord. So God says to Noah, he says, okay, you're going to build an ark and I'm going to rescue you and your family. This is one area where we see the character of God at work, and we see it numerous times in the Old Testament scriptures, despite the fact that humanity blows it. Despite the fact that there is time after time after time after time after time where God should look at us and go, man, I'm just done with them. God preserves a remnant. Time after time after time. It's like, man, you've blown it so badly, but I am not done with you yet. We see this with Noah. We're going to see this with Abraham. We're going to see this with Moses. We're going to see this with Israel time and again. God says because of who he is, he's not done with his people yet. And man, some of you need to hear this morning. The nature of God is to look at you and to pursue you and say, man, the reality is you're not so great sometimes. Right? Like all of us can attest to that. We have our moments on a regular basis, and yet if you belong to him, he looks at you and he says, I'm not done with you yet. And he will say that over and over and over again until the day that you die and you enter into eternity and he brings you home. Some of you need to hear this. If you trust in Jesus, he's not done with you yet. He never will be. And the most beautiful part of this when we're looking at a book like Genesis, is that we now live in a New Testament, New Covenant era where God has put his Spirit in believers. So he actually transforms you so that when you trust in Jesus, when you follow Jesus, his Spirit is renewing your heart, renewing your mind, giving you new life so that his life is alive inside of you. And when you trust and follow him, he's transforming you so you can walk out what he's calling you to. This is a beauty of the gospel. And we're going to see that gospel actually again begin to be pictured in the book of Genesis. We already said, man, the gospel is prevalent in the book of Genesis. You go back to creation before the fall even happens. We talked about this a few weeks ago. The gospel is showing up. Why? Because you get God creating. He's bringing light out of darkness. For pre-modern man, that was a salvific act. God was acting in a way that was making it so they could see where things were dark. He was bringing life and land from where there was the sea. For pre-modern man, the sea was a place of death. What does God do? He brings life. He makes it inhabitable. The gospel is visible in the book of Genesis, and we're going to see it here again. How? God provides rescue in the midst of destruction. So the right wrath of God is against human rebellion. He says what? All flesh should be wiped out. But the grace and mercy of God is saying, I'm going to provide a way of rescue, small that it may be. Build an ark. Friends, can I suggest to you this morning that the ark is a picture of Jesus? Specifically, Jesus is our ark. When the wrath of God is set against corruption and violence and sin, which we all harbor, God preserves us through Jesus. His life, his death, his resurrection, his coming return. And that's our ark. The fantastic news is that in the book of Genesis, while this is for a small family, what we see through the scriptures is that Jesus is going to expand that. In the Old Testament, we see shadows. In the New Testament, we see the reality. So whereas a small family was able to board the ark, in the New Testament, under the life, death, resurrection, and return of Jesus, anyone who will come now and get on the proverbial boat can get on. Jesus' work is available to anyone. So listen to me this morning. For some of you, you need to hear this. Get on the boat. God has provided a means of rescue. Get on the boat. Trust in Jesus. And then what's neat about this, the Apostle Peter is going to take this a couple thousand years later, and he's going to turn the picture of the flood into a picture of baptism. Right, so 1 Peter 3:18-22 says this, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah. while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven, is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. That is a dense text. All right, there's a lot going on there. But the idea that Peter gets at is baptism correlates to the flood. See, this is a picture of a spiritual reality where you are saved by the work of Jesus, which is based on him suffering for us, being put to death, but being made alive, and then being brought through him safely to the other side. Peter's going, man, back in Genesis, gospel picture. Your profession of faith through baptism is exactly what's happening there. He is rescuing you, he is cleansing you, and he is giving you a clean conscience through Jesus' resurrection and ascension. So listen to me again, we see the flood all the way back in Genesis is a picture of what Jesus does and what he accomplishes. You get on the boat, you are saved, you are made alive, you get a clear conscience, and Jesus is sitting in heaven with everything subjected to him as the one who says, the work is done. The work is done. Some of you need to hear this morning. The work is done. Jesus has finished it. So listen to me. When you trust in Jesus, that guilty conscience that you have is not something that you have to carry anymore. He gives you a right to a clean conscience. So some of you are holding things against yourself. God is not holding against you. Listen to me. If Jesus can forgive you, you should be able to forgive yourself. That's how the gospel works. You get a clean conscience. In Christ, you are clean, you are saved, you are removed from wrath. And we come back again to the question that Moses has been pressing us with this entire text. Who are you going to walk with? Will you walk the walk of the line of Cain into judgment and death? Or will you walk the narrow road that is the line of Seth? And even, man, that goes astray at times, but we see a remnant in Noah. Who will you walk with? Coming back to the text, Noah and his family spent 150 days on the ark. That's a long time. Man, 8-hour road trip, and I'm like, are we there yet? Right? The kids aren't the only one asking that. 150 days on the ark, and then the waters recede. His family leaves the ark with the animals, and the text gives us this brief picture of a clean slate. It's almost like another Garden of Eden. Things have been washed away. There's this clean slate, and God promises Noah, he's like, man, I'll never flood the earth again. And then he renews his mandate for humanity. He says, listen, you guys be blessed. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So a few weeks ago in Genesis 1, we talked about this doctrine we call the Imago Dei, which means the image of God. And that doctrine teaches that each of us bears the image of God. We are created in God's image. If you want to know why we believe that all people are valuable, that's why. If you want to know why you are valuable, that's why. You're created in God's image. And so the idea in the book of Genesis is that wherever man goes, the image of God is also going. And as man spreads across the face of the earth, God's image is being taken with him. And God is glorified as man multiplies. Right? So here's a few thoughts from this text. First one is this. Man, having babies is a good thing. I feel like I barely have to say that in this part of the world. I remember, I don't know, again, we're going back a few years here, but I remember back in like the 2010s, the Marvel movies were really big, right? And I remember sitting in a theater and watching Avengers Age of Ultron. Anybody see that? Am I just like, yeah? So I'm sitting in a theater. I have a Christian context in my head. I understand kind of these things. And the producers of Age of Ultron threw this joke in that I don't think a lot of people got. But in this moment, you get Tony Stark, who's kind of the loudmouth, is talking about Ultron. He's kind of reproducing at this incredible rate. He's like, man, this guy's going to reproduce like Catholic rabbits. And I just about died in the auditorium because I think I may have been the only one who got that. Catholics don't believe using birth control is okay. Rabbits, well, they go right. I feel like we're close to that in this part of the world, right? Anyways, that's where we're getting. You guys don't seem to have a problem with having big families, and that's a good thing. This is part of the creation mandate. Be fruitful and multiply. But then I say that with a couple of things in mind. Not everybody gets married, so not everybody's going to have kids. And not everybody who does get married is able to have kids. Man, that's a hard reality some people live with. And if that's you this morning, man, can you just know we love you? We're here for you. I don't always have the answers to those hard kinds of questions. But we do want to walk with people who are walking through difficult situations like that. And man, again, that's not just hypothetical. If you're going through that and you're like, man, there is some legitimate pain in my life because of that, come talk to us. We want to support you. Whether that's counseling, whether that's sitting down and crying together, whether that's getting a small group like scenario, I don't know, but I want for you to be supported. And then I think that along with all of that, we need to deal with just a practical reality where we have this mandate back in the book of Genesis that says what? Be fruitful and multiply. And then we live in this world and this era where contraception is a reality, right? Birth control is a thing. So how do we walk all of that kind of stuff out? This is a very practical question based on this text. You could go the route I said our Catholic friends go, which is, birth control in any manner is not allowed. I'm currently plucking away at my master's very slowly, and last spring I took an Old Testament theology class, and it was through St. Michael's, which is a Catholic school, the old OT Theo class that I took. And I remember we got to Genesis chapter 38, and in Genesis chapter 38 you get the account of this guy named Onan. And Onan's brother dies, and it was Onan's responsibility to take his brother's wife and to carry on the name of his brother. It's called levirate marriage, right? And what happens is Onan, rather than fulfilling that duty, you read this in the text, it's not just me making this up, he pulls out when he's about to copulate, and he spills his semen on the ground, and then God kills him. Right? This is kind of like text where you're like, you can't make that kind of thing up. But I remember my Catholic professor was like, well, this is proof that birth control is bad, right? And I kind of sat there and went, I don't know that that's what that text is getting at, man. I don't know that I see that there, right? So what do we do with this? Well, I'll start here. I do not think, based on what the scriptures teach, that contraception is unbiblical or sinful. I do tread lightly here, though, and I think Christians should be aware and careful of the methods that they are using. Specifically, there is some discussion around whether some forms of contraception act as abortifacient, specifically meaning there are some forms of the pill that is suggested may prohibit a fertilized egg from lining on the uterine wall. What does that mean? I'm not a doctor, but what it essentially means is there are some people who think you take certain birth controls, they are acting in a way that aborts a human life, right? Now, I say all of that, and I say this. If that's the case, Christians should not use those forms of birth control, right? That is ending a human life. I also say this, I am not a doctor, right? I know the internet makes us all experts, especially post-COVID, but I don't fully know one way or the other on that. I would suggest to you that you should do some research. My wife and I personally were unsure enough about that one that we moved to different methods of contraception. I do think having a conversation with a healthcare professional that you trust in regard to some of those things is probably a good idea. All of that being said, when we come to this text and we look at the command to be fruitful and multiply, what I generally kind of land on, or where I generally land, is saying that Christians should, if able, have as many kids as they feel they can raise in a God-honoring manner. For Caitlin and I, my wife, that number was 2. Partially because both of our deliveries were insane. If you know the hospital in Prince George, which is what I'm familiar with, there is a button on the wall that the nurses or the doctor press, and when they press that button, everybody on the floor runs to that room at that moment, right? And that button got pressed in both of our deliveries. It was intense. We chose, after having a second child who was 10 and a half pounds, a natural birth, to stop at that point because thankfully for modern medicine, I didn't lose my wife or children, but pre-modern medicine, man, things would not have gone well. So we stopped and we said, man, this is what we feel God is calling us to do. I do think that this text forces us to wrestle with some questions around this. And man, this is utterly practical. This is an utterly practical question for us. And then we come back to the text and we see this. Despite the fact that God has given humanity a clean slate, 2 lines emerge again almost immediately. Noah gets drunk. His son Ham uncovers his nakedness, is what the text says. This is a euphemism for some form of incestual relationship. Very likely, Ham had some form of sexual interaction with his mom. It's grotesque. It's insanely grotesque. And it's like in the middle of God's salvation, in the middle of him calling people to walk with him, right away, again, we see that the heart of man is just corrupt. It's like we're warped right back to Eden, where there is another fall and a curse is placed on Ham's line. Text says he's going to be the servant to his brothers, but then there's also a blessing. You see that the God of Shem will be blessed. Canaan will be his servant. And God will enlarge Japheth, which is Noah's other son. He will dwell in the tents of Shem. What's going to happen is we're going to watch as, again, one line of humanity is going to walk away from the Lord and descend to the Tower of Babel. We're going to get there soon. And another line is going to track to a guy named Abram, who God will bless all of the earth through. One line to judgment, one line to promise. And man, we are pressed with this question again. Which lineage will you belong to? Will you walk with God or will you walk away from him? And that's the question that this text is going to press at us again and again and again. And so listen to me. In the midst of a culture that, man, is just torn right now. In the midst of all of the distractions that you have available to you. In the midst of really a world where you can kind of disappear. You can trick a lot of people around you and make them think that you're one way, but you're actually another. In the midst of all of that, this question is pressed to you. Which lineage are you a part of? Are you a part of the lineage that is God's people, leading to promise, leading to salvation? Or are you someone who is going to walk away from him into destruction and wrath and judgment? I'm going to invite you to stand with me this morning. We're going to sing this song, Christ is my firm foundation. And I think that it's appropriate in light of all of this to invite us to once again come to a point where we say, man, I am walking, I am standing, I am placed on a firm foundation, and that's Christ. And man, if there's stuff in your life, you're like, yeah, you know what, I haven't really been walking with God. I haven't really been walking according to promise. I haven't really been seeing this thing out. Man, this is your invitation to come in and to sing and to declare, okay, God, you know what? I recognize that this is where my life's at. Would you help me to step back onto that path? And maybe you've never walked on that kind of a path before where you're like, I'm following Jesus. You're doing the Kanye thing, right? Where you're actually walking the footsteps of Jesus. There's an invitation for you this morning too, to step into this line of promise and to become a child of God. So let's sing together.